Montana Territory, autumn of 1881. The fever had her shaking so hard the cot beneath her creaked. Her skirts were soaked through with sweat, her lips cracked, her voice just a rasp. But when she heard hooves outside, she forced the last of her strength into a cry. Help, please. Then silence. Just the wind against the cabin walls and the low groan of her own breath. The door creaked open. He filled the frame like a shadow against the fading sun dust, covered, tall, and rough around the edges. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his eyes, but she saw the way they searched the room before landing on her crumpled form on the cot. "Ma'am," he asked, stepping inside without waiting. His voice was steady, low. "You hurt," her teeth chattered too hard to answer. Her arms trembled as she tried to sit up, but he was already beside her, kneeling. He touched her damp forehead gently. "You've got a bad fever," he said, voice softer now. "I'm going to help you." She stared at him, blinking through the blur. He pulled off his gloves and reached for the basin at the bedside. The cloth was stiff with old blood. He tossed it aside. "You got a name?" he asked, wringing a fresh cloth from his saddlebag. "Sylvie." Her voice caught. "Sylvie Oakley," he nodded. "Vayden Zeller." The cool cloth pressed against her forehead, and she exhaled shakily. He moved with care, his hands strong but tender. She could barely keep her eyes open, but she felt the way he moved around her, lifting her gently to change the sweat-soaked bedding, draping her with clean blankets from his pack. She felt the way he stayed. In the days before the fever took hold, she had kept her world together with threadbare strength. Alone in this cabin, with nothing but the weight of memory and the sharp silence of the hills. Her father's land, now hers, with a garden that had failed and a winter closing in fast. She had held on. Until the fever came. "I thought no one would come," she whispered. "I was riding through, saw smoke too thin for a chimney, figured something was wrong." He brought her water, lifting her head to help her drink. She coughed, but it helped. Her fingers brushed his wrist just barely. "You live alone?" he asked. She nodded weakly. "Since spring." She didn't say more, and he didn't push. He stayed through the night. When she woke, he was still there, feeding the fire, checking her pulse with a hand that was warm and sure. By the second day, the fever broke. She woke shivering, breath fogging in the chill air, but her head was clearer, her skin no longer burning. She tried to sit up on her own. Vayden was sitting near the hearth, sharpening a knife. He looked up, saw her moving, and smiled just a little, but it reached his eyes. "You're back," she blinked at him. "You stayed. Someone had to." He stood and walked to her, slipping a hand behind her back to help her sit. She winced, but it felt good to be upright. "You're lucky," he said. "Another day like that and your body might not have come through." She looked at him fully now. He was younger than she had thought at first, maybe 28, maybe 30, but his face was worn by dust and sun. His jaw was strong, his eyes steady. There was something in his presence that made her feel safe. "Steady, you a doctor?" "No," he said, pouring her a cup of broth. "Just a cowboy with more trail medicine than most." She drank slowly, and he stayed near. She caught his gaze once, and he did not look away. "You live nearby?" she asked. He shook his head. "Was headed south before the snow sets in, but I can stay till you're steady on your feet. You already saved me. I do not leave things half done." She looked down at her hands, pale and trembling. "I do not even know how to thank you." "Then do not try," he said gently, brushing a bit of damp hair from her forehead. "Just get well." She felt the warmth of his touch long after he pulled away. By the fourth day, she could move around the cabin, slow but upright. Vayden had brought in wood, patched the firewood stack, and even fixed the broken hinge on the root cellar door. He was quiet but kind. Thoughtful in ways that made her throat ache. He never asked about the grave behind the cabin. She never mentioned the baby shoes still tucked in a basket by the hearth, but when he found the tiny shoes while reaching for more kindling, he paused, looked at her. She saw it in his eyes. He understood. She turned away, but his voice stopped her. "You do not have to hide pain from me, Sylvie." She looked back at him. Her lip trembled, but she nodded. That night, she told him about her husband dead 5 months now, crushed under a horse while riding fence line. Told him about the baby lost 2 weeks later to illness. Told him how the spring rains had washed out her nearest neighbor's wagon and taken every ounce of help with it. Told him how she had not spoken to another soul since July. I did not think I would make it to winter, she admitted. He sat beside her, silent, then reached for her hand. Held it gently, his thumb brushing the back of her knuckles. You will. You are not alone anymore. She looked down at their joined hands. Why are you really still here? He watched her for a long moment. Because I wanted to be, because you cried for help and I heard it. And because I have not wanted to leave since. She felt something shift deep in her chest. I am not broken, she said, voice small. No, he said, you are still standing. She leaned into him then, slow and unsure, he let her. His arm came around her shoulders and she felt the beat of his heart through his shirt. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling low. Her head against his chest, his hand warm around hers, and somewhere deep in the quiet warmth bloomed, not the fever kind, this was something else. Steady, real, she did not know what to call it yet, but it felt like the beginning of something she thought she had lost for good. The first snow came with quiet steps. It dusted the ground before dawn, soft enough not to wake her. But when Sylvie stepped outside, still wrapped in the worn shawl Vayden had hung near the stove, she saw the pale shimmer across the grass and crooked fence posts. The air bit at her skin. She didn't mind. It was the first time she'd stood on the porch since the fever. Vayden was tending to the mare by the corral, brushing out her mane with slow, even strokes. His coat was patched at the elbow, his breath white in the cold. He didn't look up right away. She's favoring her left leg, he said, still bent to check the hoof. Might have caught a stone on the ride down yesterday. Sylvie tucked the shawl tighter. There's liniment in the barn, shelf above the oats. He gave a small nod and led the mare toward the barn without another word. She watched him disappear inside, her fingers tightening around the railing. That barn had been built by her father's hands. She remembered the sound of hammering echoing through the valley, remembered helping him carry cedar planks when she was barely tall enough to reach the latch. She turned toward the hills. The snow hadn't stuck in the higher grass yet, but it wouldn't be long. Winter was coming fast this year. Inside, she put beans to soak and set a kettle over the fire. Vayden returned quietly, shaking snow from his hat and hanging it near the door. She'll be all right, he said, voice low. Just stiff. She's older than she looks, Sylvie said, turning from the hearth. Like everything here, he studied her a moment. You ever think about leaving this place? Her eyes held his. Often, but I never do. He leaned against the wall, arms folded. Why not? Because it's mine. And it's all I have left that still holds shape. Vayden shifted, his jaw working. Place like this, it's got memory in the wood, she nodded. Some days that comforts me, some days it presses down so hard I can't breathe. He didn't answer at first. Just watched her as the kettle hissed to a boil, then, have you got enough for winter? She hesitated. Some, not all, I can trap and cut more wood. You've already done more than I could ask. I'm not waiting for you to ask. She turned back to the fire, but her breath hitched. He didn't touch her, didn't move, just waited. I don't know how to let someone stay, she said quietly. His voice came just as soft. I don't know how to leave someone who needs me. She looked over her shoulder at him. The firelight caught the side of his face, the hollow beneath his cheekbone, the stillness in his eyes. Where were you headed before you stopped here? Helena, there's a man there who owes me wages. Will you go still? Not if you ask me not to. The kettle began to whistle. Sylvie didn't move to lift it. Then I won't, she said. The room went quiet again, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of quiet that settled like dust in sunlight, undisturbed, welcome. That evening he brought in a grouse and showed her how to clean it without wasting meat. She sliced carrots while he worked the skin from the breast, his hands practiced but gentle. They didn't speak much, but something passed between them in the rhythm of shared work. When the stew was simmering and the sky outside had turned a deep indigo, she poured 2 bowls and sat across from him at the little table her husband had once built. The wood had split along one leg, and her husband's initials were still carved beneath the lip. She traced them with a fingertip as Vayden ate. He didn't ask about the carving. She didn't offer anything more. After supper, he took out a small tin from his saddlebag and opened it to reveal a deck of cards worn soft at the edges. You play? He asked, setting them down. Not well. I'll teach you a quiet game. They sat across from each other, the cards between them, the fire popping behind. He showed her how to count points by pairs and runs, how to hold back a high card and when to play low. She watched the way his hands moved, how his fingers tapped the table when he was thinking. His eyes held a calm that didn't waver. "You don't talk much about yourself," she said, laying down a pair. "I will if you ask. Did you ever have a place of your own, once, north of Miles City?" It didn't hold. What happened? He looked down at his cards. Fire, dry season took the rest. She didn't press. When they finished the game, he stood and gathered the dishes without a word. Sylvie sat still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the way his shoulders moved beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. He had stayed longer than anyone had since the funeral, and he hadn't once asked her to be anything she wasn't. As he rinsed the bowls in heated water, she stood and stepped beside him. "I could use help cutting the seed potatoes tomorrow," she said, voice quiet. He looked at her, then nodded once. "I'll bring the sawdust from the barn. Keep them from spoiling." She reached for a cloth and dried a bowl beside him. Their hands brushed. No one moved away. Outside, the snow had stopped. The cold deepened, but inside the cabin, the warmth held. By the second week of snow, a rhythm had taken root. Sylvie rose before first light, moving slower than she once had, but steady now, her breath even and clear. Vayden saw to the animals, sometimes before she even heard the door shut behind him. They shared breakfast without hurry cornmeal mush, sometimes biscuits if the flour held out. Neither of them spoke much then, and neither needed to. That morning she found him splitting kindling behind the cabin, sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the cold. The axe bit clean through the wood, his breath steady. She leaned against the doorframe, watching. "You always work quiet like that?" she asked. He paused, resting the axe head in the snow. "No sense in talking to trees," she smiled, one corner of her mouth lifting. "You ever get tired of doing for other folks? I don't see it that way." He picked up another log. "Some things just need doing. Doesn't matter whose hands get it done." She stepped down into the snow, shawl pulled close. "You always this steady?" A faint crease showed between his brows. "No," she waited. "There was a time I couldn't sit still," he added, aiming the axe again. Thought moving on was the only way to keep from feeling too much. She didn't answer right away. Her boots crunched softly as she walked over and gathered the split wood into her arms. What changed it? He looked over at her, snow flurries catching in his dark hair. "You lying on that cot." Her throat tightened. She looked down at the bundle of wood she held. "That day," she said, quiet, "I didn't expect anyone to come. I'd stopped hoping for much, I know." They didn't speak again until they reached the porch, arms full. Inside, the fire had sunk low and the coals glowed red beneath the ash. She knelt to bank it, and he set the wood beside her, crouching down. "Your hands," he said, glancing at her knuckles. "You've split more than bark." She flexed her fingers. "They'll heal." He took one hand gently, his thumb brushing over the scraped skin. "You shouldn't be doing all this alone." "I'm not." Their eyes caught. The silence stretched. Later that afternoon, she took him out behind the barn, where the slope dropped into a hollow thick with cottonwoods. The snow here lay deeper, undisturbed but for the tracks of deer. She pointed to a crooked post half sunk near the tree line. "Used to be a smokehouse there," she said. "My father built it before I was born. It caved in 5 winters ago. You think of rebuilding it, couldn't manage it alone." And I didn't see the point after. He waited, but she didn't finish. Instead, she looked at the trees, their bare limbs black against the sky. "I used to think this land would be full of voices. Children, laughter, stories told at dusk, but it's been quiet a long time." Vayden didn't speak. He stepped closer, his shoulder just brushing hers. "We could rebuild it," he said after a moment. She turned her face toward him. "Why would you do that?" "Because a place like this deserves sound again." She swallowed, her breath rising in the cold. "You always talk like that, only when I mean it." That night, she took out a cedar box from beneath the bed. It held her mother's sewing things spools dulled with age, bone buttons, a bit of lace yellowed at the edge. She hadn't touched it in months. Vayden was mending the harness by lantern light, his fingers deft with the leather. She sat beside him, laying out the contents of the box on the table. "My mother taught me to stitch before I could write my name," she said. He glanced over. "You still have her hands." People used to say that. He worked in silence a while longer, then asked, "What would you make if you had everything you needed?" She looked at the thimble, worn smooth. "Curtains, a warm quilt, maybe a dress that hasn't been patched 4 times." His voice was low. "I'd like to see you in that." She met his eyes. The room felt warmer than the fire could explain. When the lamp burned low, she stood and went to the shelf above the hearth. She reached behind a stack of plates and pulled down a small jar of rose hip jelly. Only one left. "I was saving this," she said. "For what?" "For someone who'd make the cabin feel full again." She brought it to the table, along with the last of the biscuits. He tore one in half and passed her a piece without a word. They ate slow, the jam sweet and sharp on the tongue, and when their hands brushed again, neither pulled away. Snow fell again that night, fine and steady, blanketing the hills. In the hush that followed, she felt something shift, not sudden, but certain, like the land settling after frost. Like roots finding hold. By late November, the wind carved deep through the valley, and the snow packed hard beneath the trees. Sylvie hung the last of the laundry near the stove, clothespins stiff between her fingers. Vayden stood at the workbench he'd built against the back wall, carving notches into cedar planks. His shoulders moved with quiet purpose, sawdust catching in the folds of his shirt. She watched the line of his back a long moment before speaking. "You've been shaping that timber 2 days now." "What's it for?" He didn't look up. "Shelves for your jars. You've got them stacked 3 deep, and I nearly knocked over the pickled onions this morning." She pressed her lips together, not to hide a smile, but to steady the warmth rising in her chest. "You pay attention to things most folks never notice." He set the chisel down, finally meeting her eyes. "I was raised by a woman who never let a thing go to waste. She'd tan my hide if she knew I let a jar sit where it could break." Sylvie folded the last towel, worn soft and thin from years of use. "Your mother still living?" "No, died when I was 20. Kept the ranch going 6 years longer than anyone thought she could after my father passed." He leaned back against the bench. "She never remarried, said she was too tired to teach another man how to speak plain." Sylvie chuckled, low in her throat. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "She would have liked you too. You've got the same kind of grit." There was no teasing in his tone, only quiet truth. Sylvie felt it settle in her, like the weight of a blanket drawn close. She stirred the pot of stew, the scent of bay and venison thick in the air. They'd set traps 2 days earlier, and Vayden had skinned the catch with practiced ease, hands moving swift but never careless. "I've been thinking," she said, lifting the lid. "If I could trade for a few laying hens come spring, I might start selling eggs, maybe even butter if I can get a second cow." He came to stand beside her, peering into the pot. "You could. Folks in town always short on fresh eggs once the frost settles. I've only been there twice since June. Then I'll go with you next time." She turned to him. "You don't mind being seen here with me?" His brow rose slightly. "Why would I? There's talk, always is. A man staying with a widow through winter. I don't answer to gossip, and I know what this is." Their eyes held. Heat from the stove rose between them, but it was something else that made her breath catch. "I never asked you what you saw that first day," she said. "When you stepped into the cabin, what made you stay? You looked like you'd been holding too much for too long, and you still had your boots on." She blinked. "What does that mean? Folks who have given up, they don't bother with boots." His voice gentled. "You hadn't let go yet. I figured you deserved someone to stand next to you until the weight eased." Sylvie felt her eyes burn, but she didn't look away. "It's not gone, the weight." He reached up, brushing a curl from her cheek. "It doesn't have to be. I'm not here to take it. Just to help you carry it." She stepped closer, slowly. Her fingers found his coat lapel, rough wool beneath her touch. "You've done more than that," she whispered. His hand came to her waist, warm and steady. "So have you." When she leaned in, it wasn't rushed. Just a slow breath drawn between them, then the soft press of lips that tasted like salt and smoke in winter's edge. It wasn't the kiss of newness, but of something that had been waiting to bloom once it had room. She didn't pull away, and neither did he. That night, as the fire burned low and the stew cooled in the pot, they sat close on the bench he'd built from barn wood. Her head rested against his shoulder, his arm draped lightly across her back. Outside, wind moved through the pines in low murmurs. The old boards of the cabin no longer creaked with loneliness. They held firm, warmed from within, and inside, in the hush between words, something strong had taken root. Not loud, not rushed, just true. By early December, the wind cut sharp through the pine brakes and the snow lay deep enough to hush the sound of boots. The smokehouse frame stood upright now, its beams pegged and braced, a roof of bark shingles curing under snow. It wasn't finished, but it stood straight and true, and Sylvie ran her gloved hand along the fresh cedar with a quiet pride that hadn't stirred in her chest in a long time. Vayden stepped behind her, brushing snow from his sleeves. Roof'll cure better once frost lifts. Come spring, we'll set the stone pit. She asked, glancing at him sidelong. He met her gaze, steady. Unless you've taken up carpentry without telling me. Her mouth tugged into a smile, but her voice stayed soft. I don't know when I stopped expecting things to last. He brushed the snow from the step with his boot. Well, this will. Inside the cabin, the quiet had changed. It wasn't hollow anymore. It was full in a way that didn't demand attention, just held it. The days passed in the rhythm of shared labor, and the nights in warmth that stretched beyond the stove. Each evening, Sylvie wrote small notes in the old ledger her father had left behind seed counts, whether a recipe for rosehip salve she hadn't used in years. Vayden never asked what she was writing, but he'd glance over sometimes, his eyes lingering with a kind of quiet wonder, as if unsure how he'd come to be part of something with roots. One afternoon, while she was mending the fray in her cuff, he sat beside her with an envelope in hand. The edges were worn, the seal broken long ago. I never showed you this, he said, laying it flat on the table. It's from the man who owed me wages. She looked up from her stitching. The one in Helena, he nodded. He sent what he could, said the ranch failed 2 winters back. There's not much left worth chasing. Are you sorry you didn't go? He looked at her, the corner of his jaw tightening. I think I was headed here long before I knew it. She set her sewing aside. What'll you do come spring? When the snow thaws and the trails open, he leaned back slightly, watching her. If there's room, I'd stay, help plant, put up the smokehouse proper, build a fence that doesn't lean like an old man's knees. She folded her hands in her lap. What else? His voice dropped. Wake beside you. Carry what's yours like it's mine. She didn't speak right away, her breath caught in her throat, not from fear, but from the weight of being seen so clearly. I've loved you since the second time you filled the kettle, she said. He blinked once, then let out a breath that seemed to unspool something tight in his chest. I've loved you since you asked if I minded being seen. She stood, and he rose with her. They crossed the room without rush, and when their hands met, there was no hesitation. She reached for the buttons of his shirt, not out of urgency, but reverence, and he guided her gently toward the small bed beneath the window, where the frost had painted quiet blossoms on the glass. They undressed one another slow, eyes never breaking, and lay together with the kind of closeness that asked nothing and gave everything. His hand on her back, her breath at his throat, their bodies found a rhythm that spoke without words. There was nothing hurried, nothing taken. Only shared warmth and the hush of snow falling outside. After they lay tangled beneath the old quilt, her leg draped over his fingers tracing slow circles at her hip. My name will sit beside yours in that ledger now, he said. She rested her cheek against his chest. It already does. The days that followed passed in quiet joy. Vayden began carving the cradle Sylvie had long since put away thoughts of. She didn't ask why, and he didn't explain, but the sound of his knife at work was a comfort. At the edge of the new year, they walked to town together, bundled in wool and flurries. They stopped at the church, modest and plain, and spoke their vows in front of the reverend and his wife, the only witnesses needed. No fanfare, no need. He slipped a silver band on her finger when he'd traded a tanned pelt for back in October. She pressed her hand to his cheek and whispered, "You're home now." The reverend's wife embraced her after, saying nothing, only holding her a moment longer than was polite. Sylvie didn't pull away. They rode back in silence, the sky pale and heavy with snow. That night they built a fire taller than any before. She cooked cornbread and he poured cider from the root cellar. They held each other long past midnight, their hands always touching knee to thigh, wrist to wrist. In early spring, the soil thawed soft beneath their boots. They planted together potatoes, beans, and squash. He built her a henhouse, and she traded preserves for 3 pullets and a rooster. The smokehouse walls went up strong, and Vayden shaped each board as if he meant for it to stand 100 years. One morning, as they walked the field rows hand in hand, Sylvie paused, pressing his palm to her belly. "There's something growing here too," she said. Vayden stilled, his thumb brushing her skin. "You're sure?" she nodded. 2 months. He didn't speak, only wrapped his arms around her and held her so close she could feel the tremble in him. That night he brought out the cradle he'd carved, set it beside the hearth. Sylvie traced the edges with her fingers, then rested her hand over his. The cabin, the land, their love, it all stood rooted now. Not in memory, but in what they were building together. And when the baby came dark-haired and wide-eyed, they named her Clara, after no one but the sound of wind through new leaves. She slept tucked between 2 hearts that had once been broken but now beat steady, side by side. The cabin never went quiet again.